and beyond. Our top story today, President Trump is hailing what he calls a monumental strike on Iran's nuclear sites, claiming satellite images show extensive damage, including 2 deeply buried facilities. Trump, posting on Truth Social, said the sites were obliterated, describing a direct hit on what he called the heart of Iran's nuclear program. But questions remain over whether the US strikes destroyed most of Iran's enriched nuclear material, as official assessments are still underway. Trump has also questioned the possibility of a regime change in Iran. Through a post on social media, he said he wants Iran to be great again. Meanwhile, the State Department has issued a worldwide caution for US citizens, citing travel disruptions and potential anti-American protests following the escalation. Trump will meet his national security team tomorrow in the Oval Office. He's delayed his trip to the NATO summit in The Hague by a day, a move that reflects the gravity of the crisis. And as the fallout unfolds, Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, says Trump has pushed America into another war, even warning that some nations may now provide Iran with nuclear warheads. On the other hand, anti-war protests have erupted across the US and around the world after President Trump's strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Demonstrators in New York, Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles called the attacks war crimes and demanded an end to US military action. We're now joined by Ross Feingold, political risk analyst located in Taipei, Taiwan. Ross, there's plenty of people, protests going on around the world, calling this a war crime. They're citing that international law is being broken here. Does that have any weight now in this day and age?
Zero. This will have no effect on Trump's decision-making if President Trump deems it's necessary to take further action. Now, legally, that may or may not be the correct answer. But again, people protesting, whether domestically in the United States or in other parts of the world, that by itself is not going to have any impact whatsoever on President Trump's decision-making or the advice that he receives from his national security team. Frankly, that's just the reality.
Yes, and also, Ross, obviously the information is a bit muddy coming out of Iran, and given the secrecy around the Fordo and Natanz bases, how plausible is it that deeply buried stockpiles of enriched uranium were truly obliterated? I mean, we've seen images of all these trucks leaving the sites. Some people from Iran are saying that that is some of the enriched uranium. How credible are Trump's statements to saying that Iran's nuclear program has truly been completely destroyed?
Well, President Trump certainly likes to use the word obliterated. Whether or not that actually occurred in this situation really depends on those assessments that you mentioned that are still ongoing at present. But I think it's clear that the facilities have suffered a tremendous amount of damage. They're probably inoperable, perhaps permanently. At the same time, it's possible that Iran, in the days preceding the attack, they may have shipped out some of the equipment or some of the uranium. That would have just been a prudent move, given that these are logical targets for the United States to attack. So it might very well be a combination of both. But I think we should have no doubt that Iran's nuclear weapons program has suffered tremendous damage, first from the attacks by the Israelis, including the assassination of some of Iran's top nuclear scientists, and now with the very likely destruction of these facilities by the United States. They've certainly been set back. And I think any statements that Iran makes saying that they haven't been set back are frankly not true.
Yes, and Trump has hinted Iran should, quote, make Iran great again. This obviously signals an active push for regime change, something that he spoke out against previously. What are your thoughts on this new political messaging by Donald Trump?
I think that the analysis is a bit more nuanced. President Trump is not necessarily calling for regime change, and certainly he's not going to put U.S. troops on the ground to invade Iran like the United States did in Afghanistan or Iraq in the early part of this century. We have to keep in mind that President Trump, his foreign policy, it's not about bringing democracy to other countries. We know this for example, from his recent trip to the Gulf countries, where he was happy to make deals with those countries. Those countries aren't democracies, they're monarchies. So I think President Trump would have preferred that Iran had taken the deal that was on offer, which would include uranium for civilian nuclear power plants that was produced outside of Iran and shipped into Iran. And in return, the sanctions would have come off and Iran could have resumed doing business with other countries, and it would have been a huge help to the economy of Iran, and it would have certainly helped the Iranian leadership with some of the pressure they face domestically, that the sanctions have such an effect on economic growth, which leads to a lot of frustration in the middle class and above in Iran. So I think what President Trump means when he says make Iran great again is just to resume its place as a somewhat normal member of the international community, even if it's not a democracy. Again, bringing democracy to Iran is not a priority for President Trump, but he would have been happy to make a deal on the terms offered by the United States where the sanctions would have come off and Iran could resume its economic and trade relationship with other countries.
Ross Feingold, thank you very much. You are staying with us. We have more related developments. Tensions are rising across the globe after the United States struck Iran's nuclear sites. Iran's allies, including North Korea, have issued strong statements. North Korea has condemned the strike, accusing the US of exploiting the security interests of sovereign states. Meanwhile, European leaders are calling for calm. France, Germany and the United Kingdom have urged Iran not to escalate the situation and to return to talks over its nuclear program. Australia has thrown its support behind the US action, saying the world cannot allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Iran's uranium enrichment to 60% had no civilian purpose. Let's take a listen in to the Australian Prime Minister.
Has long agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, and we support action to prevent that, and that is what this is. The US action was directed at specific sites central to Iran's nuclear program. We don't want escalation and a full-scale war. We continue to call for dialogue and for diplomacy. As I've said for many days now, we are deeply concerned about any escalation in the region, and we want to see diplomacy, dialogue and de-escalation.
The IAEA recently reported that Iran now possesses enough enriched uranium for up to 9 nuclear weapons, if purified further. As diplomatic efforts intensify, regional stability hangs in the balance. We're once again joined by Ross Feingold to discuss this in more detail. Ross, I want to talk about Russia first, which we've mentioned previously. The former Medvedev has suggested some states might transfer nuclear warheads to Iran. Which states could he mean, and how realistic is that threat?
Frankly, I don't know which states he means, and his threat is probably unrealistic. The likelihood that North Korea or even Russia would send nuclear weapons to Iran at the moment is probably pretty small. So the reaction from Russia over the past few days has been mostly angry words, but are they going to send weapons or to Iran? Not at the moment. They need whatever weapons they have for their own war in Ukraine. So it's not a surprising reaction from Russia, a lot of bellicosity, a lot of angry words, the leadership taking to social media. President Putin will probably say some things to the press as well. But I think that's mostly just talk because Russia is too busy with the war in Ukraine at the moment.
Yes, and Ross, we've seen Abbas Araghchi and his delegation first of all head to Europe, and now he is in Moscow. What are your thoughts behind these negotiations? Diplomacy still active in regards to this. However, US talks have come to a close since these strikes. How much power does diplomacy now still have in this situation, if any?
Well, that goes back to the point about the deal on the table, which is a good deal for Iran. If Iran is being honest, if their nuclear program truly is only for civilian nuclear power purposes, then they should accept the deal that the United States and Western countries have proposed, which is that uranium would be enriched outside of Iran and shipped into Iran for use in civilian nuclear power plants. And that's probably the message he received in Europe. I don't really know what Russia could tell him. Maybe it would be in Russia's own interest to tell Iran, just hold out, keep on fighting the Americans, don't give in to the deal proposed by the United States. But that's probably mostly talk. Russia being busy with its war. I mean, they do send money to Iran in return for drones, and that's been well documented during the course of the war in Ukraine. But in a way, that's a little bit of financial help and a bunch of moral help from Russia. But that's not really going to help Iran. If Iran continues to be belligerent, if it doesn't reach a deal with the United States and the Western countries, it might very well get bombed again by the United States. And clearly Israel is continuing its military campaign against Iran at the moment. So it's up to the Iranian leadership to make a smart decision. And I don't think they're going to get very good advice from Russia at the moment.
Yes, Ross, and finally, one of Iran's allies, Pyongyang, has spoken out against the American strikes. But does this condemnation carry any real weight, or is it merely theatre?
This is mostly theater. This is kind of like the protests in some places in the United States or around the world. It's going to have zero impact on the decision-making of President Trump or the advice he receives from his advisors. But one thing to watch now that President Trump has been in office several months, anything that comes out of North Korea, we also have to keep in mind the possibility of a resumption of those Trump-Kim talks and the relationship they had during President Trump's first term. So there might be some angry words that come out of North Korea, but I think Kim Jong-un is still hoping he could resume that relationship with President Trump.
Ross Feingold, thank you very much for joining us. We have more on this developing story. Iran activates